Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vincent Emanuele, and we are joined by Helmut Walser Smith, who is the Martha Rivers Ingram Chair of History and Professor of German Studies at Vanderbilt University. He is the author of numerous books, including German Nationalism and Religious Conflict, 1870 to 1914, The Butcher's Tale, Murder and Anti-Semitism in a German Town, and the editor of multiple other works. Thanks for joining us today, Helmut.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
We specifically asked Helmut to join us today because of an article I came across in the Washington Post entitled, "No, America is not succumbing to fascism. The resistance is proof of that." And I thought it would be interesting to have this conversation with Helmut. As many people know on the program, we've spoken with activist organizers, scholars, historians from all over the world about the Trump administration, about what's happening in this time, both in the United States and around the world. And I actually found your article, Helmut, to be one of the more uplifting, though also, sort of sobering articles that I read about this particular topic so far. So let's start by, I wanted to ask you sort of what are some of the key elements and dynamics of Nazi rule in the first years after they took power?
Well, what I outline in the Washington Post essay is that there are essentially three. And one is, aside from the simple business of taking over the centers of power, aside from that, there's the very important shift, which we call in German Gleichschaltung, which means to bring all of society into the same gear. That is to say, co-opt all of society. So all the institutions that we rely on, your radio show, my university, journalists and all of that, they too were on board. And that's something that's obviously very different here. A second is just sheer coercion. That is to say, the Nazis very, very quickly put up a system of arresting people, of sending people to concentration camps, and the numbers were not small, they're quite large. And so that element of coercion is also very different. I'm not saying that there aren't moments when the state, the Trump administration acts like a police state, but it's not that kind of police state. And the third, and this is, I don't want to call it more abstract, but this is the more complex one, let's put it that way. And that is the relationship between, that is about the persecution of minorities. And what I argue is that it works very different. Here in this country, there is some of that. There's targeting of minorities. I'm very aware of that. But there is also a great deal of concern, of protection, of people flagging their solidarity. And that evaporated very, very quickly in Nazi Germany. And instead, you actually had not just a government attacking a people, but you had a people attacking, people, minority groups. And that's a very different and significantly scarier dynamic.
I wanted to go through sort of each of these because in the first part of the essay, you write about Hitler coming to power in 1933, that it was an overwhelming majority and that it was transforming the democracy to a dictatorship, with most Germans supporting this. This right off the bat is significantly different than the Trump administration. So in the United States, you have maybe 55 to 60% of people even participating in elections. If you take the total number of people over the age of 18, it's around 50% of eligible age voting Americans participate in the election. And then even out of that, the majority supported Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. You only have, in the end, you have maybe 23.5 to 24% of the total voting age population in the United States that actually cast a vote for Donald Trump in the last election.
Right. So it is also the case that of the various fascist parties, the Nazis get more votes than the others do. But they also never actually had a majority in a free election. But that was never surprising because this is a kind of electoral system where no one ever required majorities. It was about building a coalition. And so in the whole Weimar Republic, there was never a party that achieved by itself a majority. And in fact, that the Nazi voting in the summer, pro-Nazi voting in the summer of 1932 was the second highest voting tally any single party had ever gotten in the whole Weimar Republic. So their voting levels are really high. What I think happens, though, is that, and I say I think because historians necessarily have to speculate a little bit, because certainly after March 33, there's nothing like a free election again. So we have to speculate, as did W.E.B. Du Bois, about the level of support. And I certainly side with those historians who think that because he was able to beat down the very, very high unemployment rate, and because Germany basically snubbed its nose at the victorious powers in World War I, rebuilt the army in a series of other such things, I think his popularity likely went up. And I think that Du Bois overestimated with 90%, but I think that there would be many credible historians who would say, yeah, 40 to 50%, I can imagine that. 50%, maybe more, I can also imagine that. And then there's also the difference of whether you support someone and like them, see them as your leader, and whether when given a choice to vote back your Catholic member that your family always voted for, you might still vote for the Catholic. And I think that there are, for example, a lot of Catholics. Germany was 2/3 Protestant, 1/3 Catholic. I think there are a lot of Catholics who supported Hitler in those years. But if given the choice, they might have voted for the candidate that their families always did. So I would put that support as pretty high in the 1930s, and pretty high indeed until about 41, until the war starts going really sour, actually, in 43.
What did the process look like? Because you mentioned trade unions, schools, and churches. What did the process look like for them to sort of be brought into this national project?
Right.
What did that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because this is something in that short article, I wasn't able to go into.
Sure.
But what happens here is that there are some people in the regime, in the organization, that are pro-regime, and those people are in a way supported by the regime itself. It would be like if your boss were a Nazi and he would then support the other co-workers who are Nazis. And if you were, opened your mouth too much, you would be purged of your position. And so that's what's going on in the churches, the unions. Many of them rename themselves to make it appear, and in fact, it was a de facto situation, to support the regime. And again, this too is something that's not here, right? We don't have, to be sure, I'm sure there are some organizations out there that have done this. But when we look at the landscape of civil society in the United States, that's not what we're seeing.
Yeah. No, we're seeing universities, as you mentioned in the essay, universities. Speaking as a military veteran, I've been happy to see members of the military, particularly upper echelon generals and higher brass, speak out about the administration. This seems to be a fundamental difference.
Yes, and it's interesting. There were this was posted in various places and also some social media that I have access to, so I could follow the conversations. And there were some conversations of military people, and some very much supporting the argument, and others not so much. But this is still an open society. This is still, and even within the military, where there's a debate about this, and there are people on both sides of that. And again, that wasn't really the case.
And the racial element within the military in the United States seems to be significantly different as well. In other words, we served with a disproportionate number of Black and Latino veterans and Marines. I was in the Marine Corps, and I can't imagine. I mean, many of whom, of course, end up in significant positions of power. And any kind of a political project in the United States that revolves or has this like strong ethnic racial element to it, I just don't see how that would be supported by significant sectors of the U.S. military.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, the armed forces are one of the most integrated institutions in the United States, as far as I can see. And this means that it's not easily co-optable by politics that target racial minorities who are our generals, colonels, and soldiers. So
Right.
I think that the diverse nature of our armed forces is one of the real solid and strong and important aspects of our civil society. And that's, again, so different from Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
That's a great point. It's also probably a point that could be made about the police forces in many major metropolitan areas in the U.S. too. I mean, we would be in an even worse situation if these police forces were just, solely white.
That's correct.
That's
correct.
This is.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
One last thing, since on the military question, as it turns out, the military in the long run in Nazi Germany does become one of the centers of real resistance. And that is also because within it had also these very important independent traditions. Like the tradition of the Prussian aristocracy, which not everyone in that tradition embraced Hitler fully. And in the end, it's that tradition, that separate power base, that's where the assassination attempts happened. That's the milieu from where this happened. So the question of where the military is in dictatorships or fascism, however you want to call it, I think it's one of the great and central questions. And it would be good if we spent more time on it here as well.
I completely agree. And on a positive note, what I've seen shift, I was in the United States Marine Corps from 2002 to 2006. And when I got out of the military, the attitude in the military, reflected by opinion polls, not just my anecdotal experiences, but reflected by the opinion polls, was quite conservative, sympathetic toward neoconservative policies. During the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders received more donations from active duty military personnel than every other Democratic candidate combined. And the opinion poll now show that Biden has a pretty significant lead among active duty military personnel over Trump, which is also significant because the polls show that, of course, I've been opposed to the war since the second time I went, the second deployment I went to Iraq. And the polls also show that a significant number, a majority of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans think that both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were mistakes. So the politics within the U.S. military is always changing, and in my opinion, fortunately, it's becoming more and more progressive. This is a little off topic, but I'm interested because of this racial dynamic, this ethnic racial dynamic that we're talking about. To sort of prepare for this interview, I went back and I started reading history of fascism, both in Italy and in Germany. Do you think it's important to make a distinction between Italian fascism and Nazism? Do you think that matters? Is that more of a university thing that people sort of in that world should be worrying about, and the rest of us should be like focused on stopping authoritarianism when we see it? Or how do you sort of see that? And do you think that one of the, as I've been reading the last couple of days, it seems one of the maybe significant differences between the two is that racial and ethnic component?
Yeah, so there are a lot of interesting thoughts and questions in what you just said to me. So let me back up and say, first of all, in terms of my expertise, I'm really a German historian. So that's the story I know very, very well, I would say. And I know the Italian case less well. But I do think that the racial dynamic is a very central element of it, because this the Third Reich is a regime for which the racial dynamic, which centers up until 1941, centers on expelling the Jews of Germany, simply getting them out of German-controlled area. And then ultimately it emerges into a genocidal program. But that's a driver of the regime in a way that I don't believe is the case in Italy. So I do think that that's a fundamental difference. I also think that the levels of brutality and the levels of, well, the images of conquest are significantly larger and more ambitious in the German case. I don't want to downplay the Italian side on this. It's also important. The image of sort of a fascist Italian empire is also important to that regime. But it has huge consequences because the Nazis imagined that the only real place for that is the East. And that means a clash between two gigantic and powerful countries in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So it has consequences of a different dimension. There is a debate about this. You might say in the Ivory Tower, or you might say among progressive intellectuals. I think when I look at the reactions to that article, most of the critical ones, and there were a lot of critical ones, most of the critical ones are insisting that what we're looking at is fascism or descent into fascism nevertheless, and there are a whole number of other kinds of fascism. One doesn't always, so runs the argument, have to focus on Nazi Germany. And I say, okay, we could have that discussion again concerning other fascisms. I would say call in a better expert than me. But I do think that when Americans hear fascism, their go-to place in their mind is Nazi Germany. It's the most notorious case. It's the case with the most damage wrought on the world. And that's the case that I wanted to center more than had been, in my opinion, in that article.
Now, as you're saying what you're saying, I'm thinking to myself, significant differences. You named some of them. We'll sort of get back to the other 2 points that you made. I think a little more about race as well, but also treatment of mine. But also, I'm sorry, the points you make about incarceration, which I think are important. I mean, the incarceration of political dissidents, socialists, and communists explicitly. But as you're speaking, I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if you agree, but I would argue, and I agree with sort of the progressive left intellectuals that would say that the United States is an empire, or at least maintains a military empire. It's different than previous empires, of course, the contours, how it functions, all the rest.
Yeah.
But we're an empire. Trump came to power with this sort of make America great again. So I think why there's probably such a reaction to articles like this, though I thought, the article made really salient points that others, I think, have skipped over when they just employ the term and have for the last 4 years. But I'm assuming you also are concerned about where we're headed. I'm assuming you're terribly concerned about where we're headed, and I'm assuming you're also not just trying to gloss over like, hey, it's okay, if people came away from the article with that, I'm assuming that's not how you wanted them to come away from the article, that everything's just going to be okay here. You make the case at the end that if we don't strengthen our civil and political institutions, which is the sort of major distinction between us and Nazi Germany, that something worse could come about.
Yeah, I tell you, in the context, and I actually wrote it almost a month before it actually got published. I wrote it, I didn't like it, I put it in the drawer, then I pulled it out again, sent it to, I don't know if I should say this, the Wall Street Journal. They weren't interested. And then I was very happy that the Washington Post picked it up. And then even then it waited for a few weeks. So I kept having to update references in it. But the context in which I wrote it was the were these debates that I saw about fascism. But then the context in which I resubmitted it was what was going on in Portland. And what worried me about Portland is that we get into a political mode, and by we, I mean people who are worried about our democracy, in which we imagine ourselves as fighting the fascists in the way that the communists did and the socialists did in 1932. It's about a fight out there on the streets, and there's no other way to stop that. And worried because I think that this is playing into their hands. I think when there is violence on the street, people are being beat up, shot, now a little bit on this side, now a little bit on that side. That's playing directly into the Trump administration's hands, because their whole policy is to make this country worse and then come in and say, we're saving it. And what is the best thing for them? To make the streets violent. And if we play along because we are enamored in the notion that we're fighting that fight again, I think we lose. I still worry that narrative has a certain amount of play in the suburbs of America, where we actually have a good chance to win. And so that's the spirit in which I wrote it. And the original title, it became something else. And, when you hand it to a newspaper, you don't know what they're going to do to it. But the original title was Why the United States Now is Not Like Fascism Then, or not like German fascism then. And all I wanted to say is this is not the fight. And the reason is because, look, we're 4 years into the regime. These things are not at all alike. And so if you have an opponent, I think it makes sense to figure out exactly what that opponent is and what that opponent wants, what that opponent thinks it can do. And to imagine that this is like Adolf Hitler, I think is just the wrong place to start.
And if we don't and this is why I was so interested in speaking with you, because if we don't understand your, maybe lack of a better term, political enemy, which should then dictate your strategy. I mean, so if you don't understand what you're trying to achieve, which I do think is a side problem, and I say that as someone who's been knee-deep in progressive organizing since I got out of the Marine Corps with all kinds of different social movements and organizations, we often go into these things in a reactionary way. We want to respond. It comes from a good place. We see an injustice. We want to do something, oftentimes without a clear vision of what we want. And without that clear vision of what we want, it's very hard to then come up with a strategy. So this continues to happen where people jump to tactics before they think about what is the objective, what is the strategy to achieve that objective, and then what are the tactics that would aid that strategy in achieving that objective. We sort of do it ass backwards a lot of times, and I've been concerned myself. I mean, the co-founder of the community space that we're in and this program, Sergio Kochergin, who is the producer behind the soundboard today, his family comes from Ukraine. He moved here in 1994 after the wall fell, or 1997 after the wall fell, several years after. We met each other in the Marine Corps and have partnered on different political projects since then. He's experienced collapse and violent responses to civil society cracking in two different contexts. I mean, well, now three. I mean, one in the fall of the Soviet Union. Again, we saw this in Iraq, whereas people just imagined Iraq to be this sort of Mad Max war zone. When we got there as ignorant, I mean, I'll speak for myself as, say, an ignorant American who grew up in the Midwest with a, sort of bullshit education that I didn't even pay attention to. I showed up in Iraq, imagined that it would just be a gigantic war zone, and I saw modern highways, and I saw factories, and I saw hospitals, and I started to think to myself, I started to imagine what the civil society looked like. And then over the years, watching it deteriorate from what it was before the invasion to then 2007, to then remaining in contact with our Iraqi friends and talking to them in 2011 and 2014 through ISIS and everything else that's happened. And how quickly violence can spiral into what could be a local interaction, a neighbor killing a neighbor, that then turns into a tribal violence, that then turns into intercommunal violence, wrapped up with religious ideology, wrapped up with economic concerns. Yeah. As a combat veteran, I'm at this point trying to encourage everyone I know on the left to take a step back, to de-escalate. I think one of my heroes for doing this on an international scale is Norman Finkelstein, who for years made the argument the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves and they should do so. And after watching that take place for 10, 15, 20 years, he finally came out and said, he wrote a book on Gandhi, and he just said, hey, look, the way forward is nonviolent civil disobedience, because I've seen what the other form of resistance has led to for 20 years. We have to try something different. I'm extremely concerned about that sort of sporadic violence, and I know this is out of your expertise, but I'm just kind of interested in what you're thinking about moving forward. And there's always this question. It's like people, I think, are sitting at home going, should I be ready for an authoritarian government to take over? Should I be ready for sort of the balkanization of the United States? What is it that I should be preparing for? I mean, I think people are very shocked and stressed out right now, and people are confused. And I wonder, from your understanding of that particular period of German history, what do you think is the most important things for us to look out for? What do you think are maybe some of the, you mentioned strengthening these civil and institutions in American society. What do you think that looks like, and how do you think we can proceed in a decent way, avoiding hopefully the excesses of political violence and all of the rest?
Yeah. Well, let me back up and mention this to address this question of sporadic political violence, because that also concerns me a great deal. I think we have to step back and remember that of the many, many protests that we've seen, the many demonstrations, the vast, vast majority are in fact non-violent, and the vast majority of people who participate them go there with that intent in mind. As you reach a certain number of these, there will, in almost all cases, be people who split off, and there will also be people who are sent by the other side to incite that kind of violence. I know that here in Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, in one of the first protests, Black Lives Matter protests this summer, there was a burning down of a part of the courthouse. Well, in the media, everyone assumed that was because of the Black Lives Matter protest, but actually it wasn't at all. It was somebody else, not an African American, someone who had nothing to do with that. And I haven't followed the story since, but the person actually ended up setting fire to one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. And so stuff like that is happening, and we have to watch that, and we have to report it, and we have to get that stuff in the news, because people don't really believe that, but it's actually true. I know this happens in the German case as well, not just back then, but also now. So I think that's the one thing to say, is that most of them have been peaceful. We have to ourselves police that it remains so. So the second, and I think larger question seemed to me, what do we have to watch out for now? Like, if in the event, there are all sorts of possibilities. One possibility is a victory for the Democrats and a peaceful change of of power as it ought to be in a democratic society. I almost can't believe I'm saying this on the air, because when is the last time we've even had to think about that, right, in this country? So that's obviously one possibility. Another, which worries me terribly, is an illegitimate election, right? That either through interference or questions about counting, or there's any number of things that that the Democrats win, or looks like they have won, and yet it's not recognized as such. The stuff goes to a newly minted Supreme Court with, you know what I'm saying. So that's a second concern, and of course, a third concern is a second Trump administration, which feels unbound because it's 4 years to the next election. So in that last scenario, what I think that there are two institutions that are really key, and it's justice and the military. So the justice, because if we land in a situation where the political opposition, or some people in political opposition, are arrested, put in jail, then we are very quickly in this land. You can look, authoritarian regimes do this too. So it doesn't really matter to me much what you call it at that point, but that point where it's no longer democracy and where political opponents are being rounded up. They do this in South American authoritarian regimes. They did it in fascist regimes. This is a big red flag. It's a tripping point. It's something we just cannot allow this country to step over. And if it starts, that's when we need to be on the streets, every last one of us, in ways that we haven't seen in a long time.
That also requires us to be quite principled. In other words, if they're going after right-wing and nonviolent, let me add that, nonviolent right-wing political thinkers, writers, media personalities, etc., liberals, progressives, leftists have to stand up for that.
That's correct.
I mean, this is very concerning to me. I mean, in this context of Trump, what I've found very concerning from some of my liberal friends is their willingness to throw some of their principles out of the window just to make political points or to go after Trump. And I first of all, that hasn't worked in the short term, and I really think it's dangerous over the long term.
That's right. I mean, I fully agree with you. It has to be about the principle. The other one, which you probably have thought much more about than I do, but in authoritarian regimes, in fascist regimes, the next big question is, where does the military stand? And the military in the United States swears an oath to the Constitution, not to the office of the president, even though, and this is the complicated part, the president is the
commander-in-chief.
The commander-in-chief. The German word was coming into my head, and I didn't want to say that on live camera. So, yes, commander-in-chief. Thank you. And so there is within our own Constitution and the way we are set up, there is an ambiguity which concerns me.
Yeah.
So that's my. And again, I would say I'm sure that you have thought about this more than I do, but it could be that we come to a situation in which there's something like that second possibility, a hung election, or an election that is not sufficiently decided to the degree that Trump would like it, although every news, everyone else has said this is the way it is. And there's a resistance to leaving power. At that point, there's a real question: what does the military do? Yeah. And to whom does the military have its oath? And that has often been the question then in these sorts of regime transitions. And I don't know how to answer that.
Well, that's why I mentioned some of the data and anecdotal experiences that I've had earlier, because it gives me some hope. I mean, I also think if you look simply at the power, the personnel power of the U.S. military in the geographical area of the United States, I've often had a hard time contemplating how exactly the U.S. military would be used to lock down maybe portions of the United States, but the entire United States with 350 million people, maybe a quarter of whom or a third of whom own weapons and multiple weapons. And this is why any of these roads we go down to imagine how this would unfold, it all for me comes back to institutions, building a certain level of healthy collectivity, which to me is, now most of the work we did before the pandemic is sort of community organizing work. Right. My concern isn't so much that everybody would line up under the supreme leader. My concern after knocking on thousands of doors throughout the Midwest is a fragmentation of society. I mean, my concern is that you can knock on one person's door and they think the earth is flat, which worries me that we're sort of in this other like counter-enlightenment era, right. With social media, with right-wing propagandists and conspiracy theorists. It's so wild to go from, if you knocked on file, I tell people all the time, just on my block here where we live in Michigan City, Indiana, you can knock on one door, that person's watching Fox News 24/7. You knock on the next door, that person doesn't watch any news, hates both political parties, doesn't want to talk about it. I mean, and I don't need to go on, but I mean, it's from one house to the next. And I find that so jarring. I mean, even when people talk about the geographical regions of the United States, when they say the South, I mean, Atlanta is not the same as southwestern Georgia. I'm sorry, but like even within there, you have urban and rural divides. And in every case, it seems to me that we need to have robust discussions, conversations. I don't even say debates anymore, because that, I think, brings an image into people's heads where you just pick each other apart the whole time. I mean, we need to have some really serious, adult, sophisticated conversations, and anything that's pushing us into a different direction, I think right now is very, very unhelpful.
Right. I really agree with you. And I think that even in that event look, I still think, if I have to put the numbers on it, I still think overwhelmingly that the chances are we will have a democratically legitimate election and we will have a winner. And I'm not ready to pick who I feel confident that will be at this point, but we will have one. And I think that after this election, we will have to come together and figure out how to put pieces together again. And because if we have 8 years of, well, actually, to be honest, we have had a polarized society before 2016.
Right.
2016 was an expression of the polarization of our society, it was an expression and an accelerant at the same time. And so I think we have to get ourselves back to a space where, as you say, discussion can happen. People can start to feel like the person down the street who, is either reading the New York Times or watching Fox News, what particular image is not the enemy. And paradoxically, this was part of my argument. Paradoxically, this was precisely what makes America now unlike then, because then that level of polarization, there was polarization, but what there really was a fallout of the middle, and we have that to some extent too, except that the middle all fell to the right in Germany. And the middle here falls in a very different way. I'm very concerned about when you said that there was one person who didn't listen to any news and plague on both of your houses, because I think that we underestimate that population, and that population, I believe, can go either way. But more traditionally, that population drifts into the sort of strong leader camp.
That's been our concern, and one of our pieces of advice to Black Lives Matter organizers is that at first, and you could see this in the opinion polls, in the immediate week or two following the uprising in Minneapolis, opinion polls were, and to my surprise, were overwhelmingly supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, after 2-3 months of everything else that's happened and the way that it's been spun, and also mistakes that have been made, there's a sense, not only in the polls reflect this, but anecdotally what we hear from people who are those people who kind of are just tuned out, is they say to us, I don't care how we have to get back to normal, just make this stop.
Yeah.
So, and that's concerning for sure.
That's right.
I had one more question I wanted to ask you this because I think one of the things people are asking themselves today is when they look back at these historical or they use these historical analogies, they're thinking to themselves, at what point or what multiple points could someone have done something to have prevented this from taking place? Not that there ever was going to be one thing, but I think as a historian, I'm interested to ask you, because people, let's say someone has come to the conclusion that we live in an empire in the United States and that this is a sort of declining society. They're very worried about this situation. I talk to some people who say, Vince, this is just the inevitable result of an empire, and that's history, and there's nothing you can do about it. How much of this is contingent upon what we do or don't do? And I think sometimes, especially here in the United States, there's already that sense of cynicism and nihilism towards our, the political process. Some of it I actually think is quite justified. Living in the Rust Belt and watching how workers have been treated here for the last 30 years, a lot of that cynicism and nihilism is justified.
Right.
I guess I just want you to speak to how important it is for people to feel like they have an active role in shaping history, instead of just thinking that they're passive observers and that we're on this trajectory and this is whatever's going to happen is going to happen regardless of what we do or don't do. Or maybe you do feel that way, and in which case, be honest. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
No. It's interesting. It's a good question. I certainly do feel like we control our fate in this regard. It's harder for me to say the one thing we need to do is X, and so I'm not prescient enough to figure that one out. I wish I were. But what I would say is that I think it's very important to let me back up. There is a list of books of mine that you rattled off, but and I don't want to just do this for the plug reason, but the one book, my most recent book, was not one that you mentioned. And this book is called Germany, A Nation in Its Time, Before, During, and After Nationalism 1500 to 2000, published with Live Right, a division of Norton this year.
How long did that one take you? Couple months?
If you ask my editor, it's too long, but yes.
My God.
It took me a while. In any case, one of the things that I find remarkable about the German case is the question of how after nationalism, after a country it exists in that state of extreme nationalism. We're getting there. I mean, the United States of America is a very nationalist country compared to other European countries. I don't know, I can't say compared to China, but the places that I know, that is true. But one of the things that's very interesting is how you leave that headspace and yet can still say, I love my country. I love my flag. I think this is who I stand for. Own the nation, as it were, without the nationalism. And I think that the United States is going to have to face this one because it is a declining empire. Your friends who say this are right. Our standing in the world has declined significantly since Trump, but it's not just about that, right? It's about these other big structural problems, or not even problems, but issues. It's after the Cold War. There aren't just two centers of power. There are multiple centers of power. And then, even though you have a very large military, it doesn't mean that you just get your way all the time. So the question is how to change our society in that place where we're not always the best, and yet really own what we are. And, this is a little bit the transition from warfare state to welfare state. Now, in American ears, welfare doesn't have a good ring, but, the idea of welfare was put in World War II against warfare. Warfare state is where all your society's resources go into the act of aggression, of making war, and welfare state is in where your society puts the lion's share of its resources into the well-being of its citizens. Now, that doesn't mean, and one of the unfortunate, rhetorical ploys of Black Lives Matter was to defund the police. I think one should demilitarize the police. I think one should let the military do the military and the police. But no one. I think you will get nowhere with an idea that you want to defund the police. I think
23% in the latest Gallup poll.
Yeah. And it's dangerous. We have to step up and say, no, that was just a heat of the moment rallying cry, which I can also understand.
Yep.
Right. So we have to, for that, we have to get out there and say, this is what we stand for. And I hate to say it, but no, I don't hate to say it. It has to be put in patriotic terms to some extent.
Yeah.
And this also separates me from some of the critics of my position also in this article on the left. I think we have to figure out a way to get that ground back.
Yeah. No, we do. And you sound, I wouldn't pay too much attention to them because I would argue that the people who are on the ground doing organizing work in unions, schools, universities, tenants organizations, communities, I think they would agree with you 100%. I mean, if you don't tie this to some kind of a national identity, a national project that's different than the one the right is offering, and simply trumping out, symbols from, old European socialist and communist thinkers is not going to get, I mean, it's cool for graduate students, like graduate students and people I know at universities, small percentage, they're into that kind of stuff, but most people can't identify with it. And one of the reasons why we spent so much time working on the Bernie Sanders campaign here in places like Indiana and throughout the Rust Belt is because we've seen the devastation of not only neoliberal economic policies, but also what the war has done to these communities. Everything post 9/11, from the economy to the economic collapse in 2008 to the war on terror, it's all sort of led to this point now here. And I still argue, I don't think it's the only one. So that's where I disagree with my Marxist friends. I don't think that it's the only force, nor do I think it's always the primary driving force. But I'll say, as someone who lives in the Rust Belt, if we don't deal with some of these underlying structural economic issues, I don't care what kind of sort of nice civic politics you offer people, we're going to continue to be in a very rough place trying to get people to speak to each other in a civil way if they can't even afford to pay for their overpriced apartment that they're being gentrified out of anyway. I mean, I don't want to get too far into it, but where we live, the economic situation is so dire that this is why we thought that, that campaign and those kind of projects, less for us about him and more about what that campaign stood for. But in any case, Helmut, I really appreciated this and I really enjoyed speaking with you. This was great. And I'm going to order your latest book. Serge and I will read it, and then maybe we can have you on next year. We'll talk about it. After the election, we can get your thoughts and talk about the book. And
I'd love to do that. I also had a great time talking with you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, we'll speak soon.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye, Helmut. You've been watching Park Media. I'm your host, Vince Emanuele, and we'll talk to you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parcmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at parcmedia, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.